The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the first chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
On Tuesday, I began the Theology on Tap discussion by pointing out how different our Christmas stories really are. And in our four Gospels, only two of them, only Matthew and Luke, narrate the events leading up to Jesus' birth. And although we put those two events together in our Christmas carols and our nativity sets and all the Christmas pageants and things that we do, they're actually really very different. There are no stars in the story of, as Luke tells it. There are no wise men in the story as Luke tells it. There are no shepherds in the story as Matthew tells it, but we put them all together here and we celebrate all these things, but they're really very different. And then there's John's Gospel. John's Gospel doesn't actually say anything about the shepherds or angels, doesn't even mention Mary or Joseph. Instead, he says things like there is this pre-existent Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that story is the only other kind of Christmas story we have in our Gospels. So if you put all three of those together, I said to the group, okay, so what's the overall theme? What is it? Jesus was born. That's it. Jesus was born. It sounds like the most non-threatening, most simple, easy, and really non-offensive claim of the Christian faith. Jesus was born. It's Jesus' birthday, and even people who reject any claims of Jesus' divinity probably will accept the fact that some historical guy named Jesus of Nazareth was born 2,000 years ago, and that he had a big effect on history. And even if the stories of angels in the sky and shepherds and wise men following stars sound about as likely as Santa and flying reindeer, hey, they're cool stories. People like them. We put them on our radio, and the days are darker now, both figuratively and literally, and it's a good excuse for a party. So Christmas becomes this really big social event in which people just say, hey, it's just Jesus' birthday. Jesus was born. And that might not seem like that's a big deal or a huge controversy today. But in the early church, it was a big deal, and it was a big fight. And here's why. People in general were willing to say, there is some great, big, divine, transcendent being out there someplace. Eternal, immortal, invisible, all the things that we like to attribute to God. And maybe if you can transcend this world and the stuff of this world and your own body, maybe somehow you can have a little touch to that divine, immortal, invisible, transcendent being out there someplace. And in the early church, in the first century when John's Gospel was being written, there was a prevalent form of philosophy called Gnosticism, which basically said that everything real and eternal was out there someplace, but all the stuff, your body, the chair you sit in, all that stuff, you got to transcend that if you ever want to touch the immortal, invisible, eternal, spiritual, that could be called God. So they were right with John when John said, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. It's this ephemeral thing that you can't really touch. And they were good right up until John ruined it in the 14th verse, where he said the Word became flesh. And that was the place where people went, no. How can the immortal, invisible, transcendent, spiritual being become one with created stuff? God doesn't exist within the mess and the muck of everyday life. And yet that is the Christmas story, as John tells it. That is, the immortal and transcendent power, which is God, has actually become one with God's created reality. And being born means that God is found not just out there, but right here with us. And that idea generated a big fight, which went on for quite some time. Throughout the first couple of centuries of church, people said, how can Jesus be God? How can he be immortal, invisible, wonderful God, and yet still actually be human? And there was this big fight that went on. And so when the creeds, we stand and sometimes, and we will today, we'll say the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and we talk about Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary, and after 1,500 years in the West, where we get hung up on what does it mean to be born of the Virgin, we think that the emphasis there was that he was born of the Virgin Mary. But the actual emphasis when the Creed was written was that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. Actually, that was not a controversy, that Mary could be a virgin, they were good with that, but that Jesus could be born, that Jesus could be actually human as well as God at the same time. That was a big deal. And that's why that piece of the Creed ended up being there. So as Christians, when we celebrate Christmas, we ought to understand that when we celebrate Jesus being born, we ought to recognize what that really means. We're not just celebrating an historical event to which we attach more significance than others. Instead, we're proclaiming that God is a real and living part of this created world right here and right now. Not just a spiritual being out there someplace that we hope somehow we can attain after we have transcended our mortal bodies. That's really the point of Christmas. And that's why John's Gospel has actually always been the primary Gospel reading for Christmas. It's not actually Luke or Matthew, it's this Gospel. Our faith, finally, is not about angels, shepherds, stars, or even virgin birth. It's about experiencing God as a living reality, right here and right now, in the midst of our everyday lives. And that idea should actually shake us up as much as it shook up people in the first century. If we say Jesus was born, it means that we're called to be people who look for God in the regular people and the regular events of our lives. If people could find Jesus as an ordinary person walking around in first century Galilee, or as a baby in a manger someplace, it means that we should be looking for God in the regular people and the regular events of our everyday lives, not just out there someplace. And that's always one of the things that I think is great about Christmas Day service, because the sun is up, the lights are on, we don't have so much of the, let's find ourselves in some strange mystical experience with the candles and everything. I love that stuff. But we can be in our real everyday world, and that's where we're supposed to be looking for God. Saying that Jesus is born means that we also should be people who have the courage to expect God to show up and act, even in the midst of painful times and difficult situations. That's always also what all three of the Gospels talk about. We kind of easily pass over those. Matthew's Gospel actually begins with the long genealogy of Jesus, and most people are just happy not to read that because you've got to read all these funny names that you can't pronounce. But there are 4 or 5 women that show up in the 5 in all the men that begat so and so, begat so and so, begat so and so and stuff. And it's the reminder of the genealogy of Jesus, the Lord of heaven and earth, which includes incest, adultery, relationships that were socially unacceptable. God was working in the midst of all kinds of things that we don't want to talk about in church, but that's where God was working through. We read the story last night of Jesus being born during census, and we know something about the census that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And it wasn't just a obnoxious little thing where you had to get up and travel someplace and be enrolled and pay taxes. That's the government being a pain in our butts, all the time. This was a time during which the Romans were actually creating a situation where they were going to militarily govern Judea. And it caused riots and uprisings. People were being killed. That event was remembered like we would think about as 9/11 almost. And it's in the midst of that Luke says God acted. And part of understanding Jesus being born is Jesus is not born into a nice, calm, quiet, peaceful night. Jesus is born into the muck and mess that we find ourselves in. Whether, we turn on the news and we see Aleppo and terrorism and all this other kind of stuff. That's the kind of world Jesus first came into. And we should have the courage as Christians to be able to say, even when that stuff is going on, God is there with us. And God is acting even in the midst of that kind of stuff. And for us too, to believe that Jesus is born and to proclaim that Jesus is human means that we're called to act in the midst of our everyday lives, not to escape into some kind of spiritual reality and say, I'm just going to kind of block out everything of the world and try to exist in some kind of prayerful, meditative state where I'm in touch with the divine being and ignoring stuff. So Martin Luther, who was not known for tact, got up on a Christmas morning. It was either Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, I forget which. But he got up and he talked to the congregation in his sermon, and he said, all you people, you sit there, I hear you, you're all out there, the poor mother and child out in the cold with no place to go. I would have taken them in. I would have done this. He says, well, then why don't you? You have Christ in your neighbor. There's lots of homeless people sitting here on the streets of Wittenberg. Take them in. If you actually think that Christ is in the regular, everyday neighbor because Jesus is born, then that changes the way you live. And that's really what we're called to be about. Because for us, Christmas isn't just a birthday party. It's not just a season. It's the proclamation that God really is present, even in a messy and chaotic world. It's the promise that God is never far from us. And it's the call to experience and lift up the living experience of God in our real and everyday lives.